on going back to where the SAS was formed, was the idea of having small groups which could sort of move very quickly and without sort of the encumbrances of, like a platoon or whatever, because the kind of operations that we really got ourselves involved in were a lot of intelligence gathering, a lot of hit and run logistics disruption, and that sort of thing. Now, you've got to, we worked in bigger groups, but we were always broken down into small. So we work in a team of 12, but there would be 3 4-man call signs. So we could actually split away and so on. Now, the reason we did that largely was because it's a lot easier for 4 guys to get lost in the bush than it is for a platoon. And we were all pretty specialized in the kind of work that we did. So if, for example, we were going to go and hit an ambush of a convoy or blow a bridge or whatever the case was, it was better to have 4 specialized guys than to have, a whole stack of them, because you could actually quite easily sort of split up and then meet up again. We're all very proficient map readers, etc. So, and it was far more difficult to chase us if we got into trouble. That was the one thing. The other thing was, moving in big groups for the kind of work we did was just simply not, it just wasn't practical. So it was a far more practical thing to have small call signs who could sort of team up with each other to make a bigger group if we needed a bigger group. For example, when we did camp attacks, we would do mass parachute drops, but all those guys were connected to a 4-man call sign. And, then we would, as I say, we might be platoon strength, but we would still only be sort of specifically, if we were to be dislodged from a platoon strength, we'd go and do a task, whatever it was, with our 4 men. So really, it was a practical number to work with, because you had a specialist in every, you could have a demolitions guy, a radio guy, a medic, and everybody was sort of trained with everybody else's function if it needed to be sort of overtaken. But a 4-man call sign for the kind of work we did was a lot more practical than bigger call signs.
Now, Ian, the Rhodesian SAS was also part of the British SAS. Can you maybe explain some of that relationship? And also, did you operate very differently to how the British SAS operated? Did you adjust your operation for Rhodesia at the time?
No, not really. No, the Rhodesian SAS was C Squadron Rhodesian Special Air Services. And it was C Squadron of 22 SAS, which was basically the British SAS regiment. And it was formed, going to Malaya, going all the way back to Malaya in the 1950s, was when, SAS, and bear in mind that Rhodesia was very much part of the British Empire at that stage. There were lots of Rhodesians who fought for the British in the Second World War, and then Rhodesia was sort of called into other conflicts, and Malaysia was one of them. And the SAS that went to Malaya was part of the British SAS. And right up until UDI in 1965, SAS officers were trained by the SAS in the UK, by 22 SAS, which was the mother unit. It was only in 1978 that they finally said, listen, you must drop the C Squadron thing, because we don't want you guys part of it. And it had nothing to do with the SAS. It had to do with government sort of politics and things like that. And we then called ourselves one Rhodesian regiment, one regiment Rhodesian Special Air. We weren't anywhere close to regimental strength, but the whole basis of the Rhodesian SAS was based on the British SAS. Our training was the same. Our modus operandi was the same. I think that when it came to things like jungle training, etc., obviously we got trained for the environment in which we were. The British SAS are required to operate in places all over the world, wherever Britain has got a presence. So they get trained for snow combat, for example. I'm not going to talk about the British SAS. They get trained in jungle warfare. They get trained in desert warfare. And so they have all that kind of training, which we didn't get. We were trained specifically for the environment in which we were going to be operating. We didn't need the additional sort of environmental type training, which the SAS in Britain have. But when you bring it down to basics, the kind of selection that we underwent, the basic training that we underwent, all that sort of thing was exactly the same as the British SAS.
Now, Ian, in terms of for people who don't have military experience, they get very confused about combat troops and non-combat troops. Can you explain the difference and how that all works?
Yeah, John, for every man in the field, you need logistic backup. And I would say, on average, I suppose it depends on the kind of war you fight and the kind of manpower that's available. I think that in Rhodesia, there were 4 people back, behind every man in the field. I think in some cases it goes as high as 8 or maybe even 10. When you start, it's not sort of you will be the 4 men to go, when you calculate the number of people who are dealing with, you've got transport, you've got acquisition of ammunition, you've got distribution, you've got parachute packers, you've got, the logistical backup for the men on the ground. Now, they can't look after themselves without backup. Somebody's got to make sure we've got ammunition resupplies. You can't go running back every time. So this guy who ran out of ammo, can you give us some? There's got to be somebody who's looking after that kind of logistics and that sort of admin function. And now there's a lovely story about a fighter pilot who got shot down over Vietnam. And one day, much later, he was sitting in a restaurant somewhere. And the guy came across to him and said, "You Flight Lieutenant Joe Smoke?" And he said, "That's right." He said, "Who are you?" He says, "You were shot down over Hanoi," and gives him a whole story. The guy says, "That's amazing. How do you know that?" He says, "I packed your parachute." And that's, the sort of, who packed your parachute? And somebody is packing your parachute. And that's just an analogy. But, someone is looking after you behind there. And as I say, things like food resupplies, clothing resupplies. Guys' boots get ripped apart. Somebody's on the radio at the back, and you say, we need this, we need that. And somebody's, you've got to have an organization behind the guys in the field who are actually sort of making it all happen. Because without your backup, those are the unsung heroes of any war, because they get feats of extreme bravery in the field. Without the people who are there to handle the logistics and the admin, etc., you're just not going to get anywhere, and your guys in the front line would be absolutely helpless.
Now, Ian, you've been injured in combat, and in today's soldiers, you see them with the modern helmets, the body armor. How has that changed from the time when you operated, and what sort of impact has that had on the modern soldier?
John, bear in mind that it's 40 years ago and some change since I was in combat and in the military. But when we went, we never had things like body armor and cameras and helmets. Because the kind of work that we were doing and the kind of sort of environment that we were in, those things would have been terribly cumbersome. And the sort of heat and things like that we would have, if you're down the Zambezi Valley, for example, or in the middle of Mozambique, the temperatures get up there. And it was something which was never really thought until much later on in the war, because, towards the end, when, we were up against things like armor and artillery and things like that, where a lot of shrapnel was lying around. It was only in the last really sort of 6 months of the war that we started wearing helmets on operations. It wasn't up until then we wore caps and hats. A lot of operators, a lot of the other units walked around in shorts and T-shirts. We tended to sort of cover up because our camouflage was needed, sort of a white face and white arms and legs and things like that in the bush. in Mozambique or somewhere like that, it just simply wasn't going to wash. And so we always wore full fatigues, sleeves rolled down, full on denims, etc. And we would blacken up and put hats on our heads. So that if you stood still in the bush, it would take somebody who really had sharp eyes to see you. Whereas, and then that was our own protection because, we, as I say, we were operating across border most of the time. We operated in Mozambique, in Zambia, Botswana, to a lesser extent in Tanzania. But we were always away out of Rhodesia. Whereas the guys like the Partu guys and things like that who operated inside the borders of Rhodesia, they were walking around in shorts and T-shirts and feltskins. And that was their, these days, I think that there's a lot of stuff which, looking at the modern soldier, he's got the body armor, he's got the camera, he's got the helmet and all this sort of thing. It's all, I don't really make a lot of sense of it. I suppose I can understand it to some degree, why they would want to sort of put all that kit on. And obviously body armor, you understand that. But I also think that body armor, although it's going to give you some protection, it's not going to stop a lot of, small arms, like, sort of pistols and handguns and things like that, an Uzi, which is a 9mm, or, sort of small submachine gun, which are subsonic weapons. The body armor would probably stop that kind of round. If you fire at somebody with an AR-15, an AR-15 has got a muzzle velocity of 3,700 feet per second, and it fires a 5.56 or 5.56 millimeter round, or 222 if you take it in inches. That will go through body armor. It's not going to stop. Body armor not going to stop. So there is definitely a benefit for sort of things like flying shrapnel, where you don't have, flying shrapnel comes off at a hell of a speed, but it's not aimed or it's not specific. So it might tear your body armor without going through it. I tend to wonder. I've not been exposed to the kind of training that the guys would get using body armor. For example, we used to be shown what a bullet does. We were never shown what a bullet does to our body armor, so I wouldn't know. I've never seen it. But what they used to do is they used to get these packs of clay, and they were packed into them, really, really compounded into a little box. So it would give the consistency, or so they said, of human flesh. So you could actually get some indication as to what a bullet was going to do if it hit you. And firing subsonic weapons, it just left a little hole. Very often it wouldn't even go through. And you'd fire an AK, for example, which has got a muzzle velocity of 2,300 feet a second. And it fires an intermediate round. That would basically knock a much bigger hole. The FN, which we sort of, I preferred an FN to an AK, but our guys used AKs and RPDs quite a lot. But that gives you a fairly good idea as to the kind of damage it does. And it leaves a hole like that in the clay. It's big. So, and the shock waves, as it goes through tissue and things like that, is massive and it's huge. So, it's not just the round that hits you, it's the amount of shock wave in the bullet as well. So, I'm not saying it leaves a hole that size, but the amount of tissue damage from a round going through would leave that amount of damage around the actual wound itself. And obviously, an exit wound is always much bigger than an entry wound. Entry wound is a tiny little thing about the size of the actual round itself. But the damage it's doing to the tissue is what you'll actually see. Now, with a 5.56, when we used to use Armalites, the American M16, which was used in Vietnam, fire one of those things from the same range as an AK at the same consistency of target, and it just shatters it. I mean, you see the amount of damage it does. It's absolutely incredible. And that is just from the hitting power of that round. So, things like body armor, I'm not sure that much good against it. The helmets, I suspect, unless you get a direct hit on a helmet, it'll probably deflect it and ricochet. So, I should say the helmets are, but we never used them. And it was something which we never even thought about using. When we did practice, which is a bit of a joke really, because when we did practice parachute, when we were retraining or, we just going to a training jump or a series of training jumps, or when we were on free fall course, we used to wear helmets to jump. But we never wore helmets on ops. You'd come out the aircraft as bareheaded, just sort of stick your cap into your shirt and come out. When you come out, you put your cap on and that was it, and we had these funny little, used to call them, and it was going to be a very, very rude word. They used to call them cunt caps, because that's what you looked like when you wore the thing. It had a fold up, was buttoned up to the back, and you undo the buttons, and it was flopped down like a Foreign Legion type, sort of thing to protect your neck. Most of our guys just used to cut that flap off because it was just useless. On the inside of our caps, we would wear a day glow panel. And that was because if we called in air support for any reason, they could see where we were. So then we turn our caps inside out and put them on our head with a day glow panel shade. And that was particularly important when we did camp attacks and that sort of thing, going into, when we had a lot of air cover and air support. We would, obviously a day glow panel. One of the problems was that the day glow panels also stood out like sort of targets for the guys that were shooting at you. So it's a little bit of a two-edged sword to it. Particularly going in, if you were going into a trench area or to an admin area which has been defended and you actually had to fight your way in, we, as I say, we were pretty covered throughout but when you've got a day glow panel on your head, it becomes a bit of a target. So it was good for the point of view of making sure the pilots didn't make a mistake when they came in for an airstrike, and that happened. I mean, not frequently. I mean, I know of 2 instances where our pilots were given a target indication, and they came in and fired on the position that was giving them the target indication instead of the indication that was. That they were being given. But all those cases, the guys weren't wearing day gloves on the inside of their caps. So, it was, So, I mean, those are the kind of things the later thing with helmets and so on, I think is, I think it has benefit, I presume. But how much benefit is questionable, I think.
Because that's what you're seeing nowadays in the modern battles and that. There's a lot of injuries from IEDs, artillery, shrapnel wounds and that, rather than gunshot wounds. Do you think that's changed since your time?
It's changed from the kind of warfare that we were involved in, because bear in mind that we were very, very rarely, we came under mortar attacks quite frequently. When I say frequently, a couple of times when we were on base camp, on 2 occasions, we were mortared and we were able to sort of counteract and identify and then sort of just return fire and then go and try and neutralize those positions. But a lot of what, particularly, for example, in Ukraine war, the hand-to-hand was a sort of close quarter combat that we would be talking about. We were actually shooting at each other. Seems to be, from what I've seen, from what I've heard and what I've read, it seems to be fairly rare where it's an artillery and an armor war. So these guys are firing missiles at each other, and the missiles are doing the damage. So, and it's not dissimilar, I suppose, to the First World War. I mean, we've almost done a full circle, because most of the damage that was done in, other than going over the top with these guys, I mean, practically almost mass murder. Think about it. They're sending young kids over the top of the trench to go and take 50 meters of ground, which they would probably lose anyway. and they were in man. And those guys were mowed down by machine gun fire. But a lot of the damage that was done to the troops and what became shell shock during the First World War was exactly what's happening in Ukraine now. There's artillery fire and an armor fire just doing the damage because they're firing each other's positions. And these, these missiles explode. I mean, these days it's slightly different because, you can put a GPS on a thing and control it with a computer from miles away. In those days, it was just fire. And I think, judging what I've actually sort of seen from a lot of the combat that's going on in Ukraine at the moment, that's pretty much the same thing. They're firing these things randomly, and whether they're not guided missiles as missiles have become known. These are missiles which are being fired out of, they're just sort of rapid fire out of multi, what they used to call the stolen organ, which is sort of multi-barreled weapons mounted in the back of a truck. And they fire off 30 artillery rounds, which when they explode, of course, then you've got shrapnel flying around, and that's where the damage gets done. I was very lucky on one occasion when a guy fired an RPG rocket at us and it hit a tree about 30 meters away from me, and I got skinned by a piece of shrapnel, cut my jeans, and basically just caused quite a bad gash. It wasn't anything serious. We just put a bandage on, it was fine, but that was, from shrapnel from a rocket launcher. Now, the shrapnel comes off these weapons that they find, these artillery weapons. You've got chunks, and the thing is broken up and weakened in certain places. So when it explodes, you've got this massive shrapnel flying out. And I think there are also lumps of metal inside the thing. So when it explodes, when it lands and it detonates, you've got masses of bits of shrapnel flying around all over the place. And from that perspective, you probably find that flying shrapnel, your helmet would probably protect you against that, to be perfectly honest, Josh. So there is a point. Whether it protects you, whether your body armor would protect you against that sort of thing, I don't know. Because when it comes flying out of there, this stuff is sharp and it's hot and it's flying. So, you might get look, you've definitely got a level of protection with the kind of body armor and things like that they wear. But I would tend to wonder just how much protection you get from, because one of the things that is hugely underestimated, I think, is the amount of damage that flying shrapnel can do.
Now, Ian, in some of the videos that you're seeing from Ukraine and some of these areas, you see the guys, when they're firing their personal weapons, they're firing, huge volumes of rounds off at once. Was it the same for you in combat, or was it very different?
No, we were. One of the things that Rhodesia had a problem with was supplies, because of sanctions and so on, and obviously with South Africa being our only real ally or our only supplier of weaponry, a lot of the stuff that was used in Rhodesia was actually made in Rhodesia because they created their own industry there. But the kind of rounds, the weaponry that we were using, and obviously we were able to steal a lot of ammunition from, when we captured stuff. We would take it back. So we captured massive, but we were always short of ammunition. We always were very, very conscious of the need to conserve ammunition, because you running out of ammunition on the battlefield is just not an option. So we were trained really to minimize excessive firing. If you've got a target, fire at it. If you don't have a target, one guy used to say, we're at a war. We're not there to scare our enemy, we're there to kill him. So, if you're going to start firing above his head to scare him, well, you're really not achieving a hell of a lot. And so that was, so watching these guys sort of just firing away and sort of emptying a belt of ammunition it's almost, sort of sacrilege. I look at that and I think, well, what are you trying to achieve by that? Because you're not, you definitely don't have a target. And if what you're trying to do is just scare the guy on the other side, now why don't you wait until he shows himself and then you can do something about it?
Now, Ian, in terms of you see in the modern helmets, all the soldiers have their communication and can speak to each other. How did you manage? Because you never had any of those abilities to communicate on the battlefield besides shouting to each other. How did that work for you?
Yeah, well, for starters, being a guerrilla war, we never really had, we had the odd conventional type of battle. For example, when we did those big camp attacks, those turned into almost conventional battles. But we were very used to, the call sign commander would carry what we called an A60 radio, which is very good for air to ground, and it had a limited ground to ground range. So, if you were wanting to communicate with other people within the same environment as you, it was actually quite good. If we wanted to communicate long distance, we always had a radio. There's somebody carrying the radio. I mean, the radio is massive. It's a huge thing. I mean, if you can imagine an old box computer, that sort of thing. It was in its own bag, which would then sort of be somehow sort of worked around the guys his own kit thing. And it was heavy. And we used to have to pull this thing out to try and you had to take a compass bearing, set yourself up on a map to start with, to find out where you're going to communicate with, or find out what direction you were going to be sort of communicated toward. Then you'd have to set your coax cables up and hang them over trees and things like that to actually get a proper signal, because they were basically aerials, and so the aerial antenna that you strung up, they would have to be in a V, either that way or that way, but in order to try and get that, to capture that signal in that thing. I mean, I did basic comms or basic radio communications. I never did the advanced course. So, but the guys that did the advanced course knew exactly, the reason why, and so I never bothered to find out. But I just knew that in using this thing, I needed to find out what direction I needed to set these aerials up to start with. So it became quite a cumbersome thing. And if you're in a hurry, for example, if you're in a lot of trouble, being chased, or you're looking for an urgent casevac or something like that, now setting that radio up, we took it for granted because all we had. But these days, you've got satellites floating around above you, and you've got satellite communications between your positions and between your base and so on. So, and the kind of radios that they use, I mean, your cell phone, you can carry it in your pocket. We could never do that. So, communication between each other was done by hand signals. Now, we all had, sort of signals like, to come here, and like that, and then hurry up, and, all sorts of, and sort of, look out over there type of thing. We had different types of hand signals that we would communicate with each other on the ground. We were unable to talk. I mean, we spoke in whispers all the time anyway in the bush, because there's always a possibility of some bad guy being hanging around somewhere. But when you're in a situation which, for example, when you're creeping up on a camp or trying to do an internal camp a close-in camp recce or something like that, we were very apt at being able to communicate with each other by hand signals. In sort of keeping in comms about, if you've got, I don't know, if you're trying to get somebody to move in on a target from a different angle, and there's a different call sign, and they a kilometre away, you could use, you'd probably use the A63, it had an antenna which rolled out, and it was fairly small. I mean, I suppose it was probably about, you think of an average hardcover novel, it was a bit bigger than that, and obviously quite a bit thicker, because it had all sorts of transistors and things like that inside it to make it work. And then, you do just a sort of a dial on top so you could actually change channels and so on. But the communication that we had between each other was, as I say, hand signaled. And if we wanted to communicate with someone further away, it would be done, whoever was course on commander or whoever is carrying that radio would basically make those communications. What they've got today is the communication, in fact, the whole communication, it's just come so far since those days. Just what we've got today was science fiction in the days that we were in. Somebody had told me 40 years ago that I'd be able to walk around with a cell phone in my pocket, and it was going to have a set of encyclopedias, a world map, a telephone, a calculator, a compass. You think about what your smartphone can do. Somebody had told me you'd be able to walk around with one of those things in your pocket when I was busy fighting a war. I would have told them not to change their dealer because they were smoking some really good shit.
Yeah, exactly. Now, Ian, in terms of the other thing talking about in those days, because you never had drones, you never had night vision, or did you have any of those type of things to support you when you were in the field?
No, that's all modern warfare, John. Drones and things like that have only really been available for the last 10 years or so, I suppose. They've been around for a bit longer than that, but their usage, particularly usage on the battlefield, it's very recent. We used to have what we call the FOO, or Forward Observation Officer, for mortars, for example. But it was just skill, observation skills. We wanted to go and find out what was happening over the hill. We'd send 2 guys to go and find out. We'd go and look and set ourselves up in a position with a pair of binoculars and then have a look, see what was going on. And then if we couldn't find anything, we'd go looking somewhere else. Nowadays, with the drones, it makes it so much. Look, it's a totally different ballgame. It's what we were able to accomplish with what we had was what was expected. If you were to take the modern day soldier and put him back with what we had, the guy would think you were crazy. How can I work with this? Whereas I suppose if you were to take somebody like myself and put them into a modern day operation, they'd say, listen, guys, this is far too complicated. So, it's you work with what you've got and obviously make the best, and you do what you can with what you have, and you're good at what you do. And it's the same as everything else, I suppose. If you look at the way commerce has changed, I always think of my father. He retired in 1983. He was a very senior guy in the Standard Bank. When he retired, he had never, ever used a computer. Everything that he ever did was on, was manual. It was registers and things. They used to get printouts because, computers in those days were things that took up, sort of 2.5 rooms. And then, all the data, and then they would send you a printout so you could actually have your reports and things like that. But, up until that point, he never ever used a computer, and he wouldn't even know how to turn this thing on. So that's going back, that's 40 years. So, the way things have advanced these days, if you're not completely computer literate by the time you stand at 5, then you're sort of behind things. As I say, I look at what goes on in Ukraine. I've taken a very keen interest in it because, obviously it has huge implications in so many different ways. And looking at the superfluous sort of element of the war, it just doesn't seem to be any real long-term purpose. But the effect that it's having worldwide, with grain shortages, cooking oil. I had no idea, before this whole thing started, just the extent to which we depend on that part of the world, Ukraine and parts of Russia, for our daily basics, things like, flour and bread and so on. 25%, I think 25% of the world's wheat was coming from Ukraine. And when it was combined with Russia, 40% of the world was coming from Russia, was coming from that part of the world. So we're looking at it, we're working on at the moment on 60% of what we need to feed ourselves. So from that perspective, the war has had, had an enormous effect. Fuel, and you just look at what's happening around the world, and this is something which also, war tends to, but people who aren't involved in it don't understand it. What has happened in Ukraine and the ripple effect of what has gone on, which has caused massive inflation, it's caused shortages of all sorts of things. Foodstuffs as well as fuel. You've got a shortage of fuel. Everything is affected. We've become so dependent on it. And who knows? This might be something which will speed up the, alternative energy sources. Who knows? But right at the moment, I just don't see any. I don't see any point in the war for starters. I don't know what Putin's long-term objective is there. What do you have to achieve? Because you're just going to take over rubble by the time he's finished. But the war itself, having the kind of effect that it is having internationally, is absolutely devastating. So, and how they're fighting it and what they're doing, the kind of missiles and weaponry and things like that they have, it all goes just a bit beyond I try and understand it. I can identify certain elements of what they're doing and sort of try and date it back. For example, we frequently came across Samora Michel's tanks in Mozambique. When we were operating in that area, particularly when we were sort of doing snoops around Frelimo positions and things like that, they used to defend their area with tanks. And they used to give Zanla backup with tanks as well. And we could take out a tank using an RPG-7, but it wasn't going to blow the tank up. All it would do is take the tracks off the tank. The track, would damage the tracks to the point where so they then have to bring somebody in to come and fix the tracks. And that would require bringing in logistics and bringing in backup teams and so on. So your mechanics could actually get in and put the tracks back on the tank. And that was the best we could do. The stuff that they've got these days, you fire, it just blows the tank to bits. So it's it's a very different set of circumstances, a very different war. It's a very differently equipped war. And bear in mind also, this is very conventional. It's going to turn into guerrilla war because, the more advances that are made, and at this moment it seems like a bit of a stalemate, but there's no doubt that Russia is going to eventually overwhelm them because they just can't, unless, again, to that sort of side of it. But the point is that sooner or later, you're going to find that you're going to get guerrilla forces or special forces like the SAS, not necessarily, but the equivalent of in Ukraine, going behind the scenes and blowing up ammo dumps and logistic supply routes and that sort of thing. It's going to happen. So, it's a sort of a conventional war at the moment, but it's going to definitely. If they're going to make any headway at all, they're going to have to change their tactics and change it to where because not having the amount of air support they need either is another thing. The amount of air support that Ukraine's got, from what I understand, and I might be wrong, is not sufficient to be effective. So you've got the situation like 40-kilometer convoys who are stationary and nobody taking them out. There you'd need special force troops to go in with explosives and lay the explosives and get the hell out of there and then let them blow themselves up when they, either on a time device or alternatively as a booby trap. So when somebody tries to open the door to his truck the next morning, it blows the truck at him and everybody close to him up, that kind of thing. So whether they've got those kind of forces, those ground forces who can go in and do those kind of things, I don't know. But yeah, look, it's as I say, looking at what we had, the kind of war that we fought, being a guerrilla war and the conventional war, when you've got two clearly identifiable sides sort of shooting at each other. They're two different sort of aspects of war, really.
Ian, do you want to tell us a little bit about your book before we end off?
Yeah, look, the book is it's a work of fiction, but it is about a way of life in a country under siege. In other words, a country at war. I've used I've used personal experiences in the war. I mean, in the book, just to sort of give it that sort of element of reality. But the book itself is about a guy who gets involved in the Rhodesian War and what life is like. And I say it's a story of a soldier's life in an unwinnable war, which is effectively what it was. But as I say, it's a work of fiction about a young guy who ends up in Rhodesia in the Rhodesian War. He gets very close to a family who tragically, there's tragedy involved there. And I've called it, there's a sideline, it's a story of danger, love, and tragedy, which effectively sums it up, because it was a tragic situation. I mean, everything about the Rhodesian War was tragic. It was a wonderful, wonderful country. And what I've tried to do is basically give the reader a sense of what it was like living in Rhodesia under the conditions of war, how a soldier's life was affected by it, and how people at home, or people who were in the cities, because I've said it before that the cities in Rhodesia were affected by the war, but they were affected in a way that everybody was in one way or another involved, because even your bank clerks, they were going to work for 6 weeks, and then going into the bush for 6 weeks, and it was almost like rotation. So it was a constant, continuous call-up, and so you had your civilians who were keeping the wheels of industry flowing, but at the same time adding to the war effort. So you had this rotation of soldiers coming in and out of the army all the time. That was your civilian side. The women who were not ever called up, although they were women in the forces, but they were keeping the home fires burning, sort of thing. So they'd be in offices, and your nurses, your teachers, they kept things going. Although there were a couple of incidents of direct attacks in Salisbury. There was one where they put a bomb in Woolworths and it killed 11 people on a Saturday morning. There was another one when they chucked a hand grenade into a restaurant, and that caused casualties. And then another one where they hit the Salisbury fuel depot. So from that perspective, it did come into the cities, but there was never a situation where people had to be escorted to work. I mean, people lived in their homes and they drove to and from work. There was, if you lived in the city, you would never really understand on a day-to-day basis. You'd never believe that there's a massive, really bloody war going on, sort of just a little bit outside the city sort of limits, so to speak. So it was a way of life which was, it's almost indescribable, John, because Rhodesians had such a huge spirit. There's a spirit of what can I say? It's something which is incredible optimism. That country was built from absolute wilderness, from nothing, to the breadbasket of Africa in the space of about 70 years. And the willingness to work and the work ethic and the pride and so on. In fact, I think you could probably, if you have a look at the people of Ukraine today, although they've got far worse problems than Rhodesians ever had, the people of Ukraine have got the same sense of pride and determination as the people of Rhodesia did. The difference is the people in Rhodesia, we had, there was a festive atmosphere most of the time in the cities. mean, we used to go to there was a place called the Oasis. Saturday morning, all off-duty troops and guys were there. They had these lawns, and everybody's around there drinking beer, and it was a festive atmosphere, despite the fact that you had this sort of war going on. And I've tried to capture that in my book. It's had some incredibly good reviews. A lot of people, I've had hundreds of reviews, which have, it's got an average of a 4.5 out of 5 star. So I feel quite comfortable with that. And I think it's a worthwhile read, certainly from the feedback I've had. It seems to be quite worthwhile. I'm busy writing a sequel to it as well, but it's got nothing to do with Rhodesian War.
Ian, thanks very much for joining us today and sharing some of your experiences. And it's really fascinating for me to understand a little bit more about how you operated in it. So thanks for making time to chat today.
No, nice to see you, John. And thanks very much for giving me the opportunity. I appreciate it.